Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It's the week of October 14th, and this is your Monday briefing. The Congressional Budget Office recently estimated that the federal budget deficit rose to $1.8 trillion in FY24, with a national debt approaching $36 trillion.
Regardless of who wins in this year's bid for the White House, the next president will face enormous fiscal challenges. Joining us to discuss the continuing fiscal strain facing the U.S. economy is Karl Russo. Karl, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So last week we spoke about some, good jobs numbers, but then by the end of the week we had some troubling inflation numbers. So talk about the factors that go into this increasing deficit.
Well, the most significant factors in the deficit report that came out of CBO last week was the rising interest rate costs for the federal government. They were over $950 billion last year, more than we spent on national defense. The other primary driver was actually increasing costs for the health mandatory spending programs. So think about Medicare and Medicaid, which are continuing to grow for demographic reasons. And those are really the primary drivers of the fiscal imbalance.
Karl, one question we get from clients all the time is what it might take for Congress to feel a sense of urgency about these burgeoning deficits. Certainly the public sees this and scratches its head. I'm curious what you think might drive Congress eventually or finally to perhaps do something about these deficits.
Well, the last time we saw significant policy action on the entitlement programs was really in 1983, where the week that the checks weren't going to go out for Social Security was the week that we actually resolved those issues and saw increases in the tax rates on those programs, as well as adjustments to the spending initiatives there. Currently, the projection is that the Social Security Trust Fund will run into problems in 2033, and that the Medicare Trust Fund will run into problems in 2036. So I think it's probably unlikely that we see significant bipartisan action on the deficits related to those programs until those dates come to fruition.
So, Karl, last week, the results of the Pulse survey came out, PwC's Pulse survey, and the survey this time was focused on executives' perception and concerns about the election. And there was a high amount of concern related to tax and trade policies as post-election, regardless of who wins. They feared that it could be harmful for U.S. competitiveness. So how do you look at this and think about this in terms of the deficit and the role of these policies in competitiveness?
Well, if you think about the primary ways in which both candidates are trying to raise revenue to offset some of the other things that they would like to do, on Vice President Harris' side, she has very significant corporate tax increases, which the OECD says are some of the most harmful for economic growth. And on former President Trump's side, you have very large increases in tariffs revenues, which have all concerns for economists on sort of what that means for global trade and could be really contractionary for economic growth. And when we think about sort of the deficits, they're really measured not just in nominal dollars, though those are also staggering, but also relative to the size of the GDP. And so when you have policies like that that are likely to constrain the growth of the economy, that raises significant concerns. And I think you're seeing anxiety about that reflected among executives because they're seeing it sort of on both sides of the aisle.
Karl, you mentioned executives, so let's have our last question focus on companies. What actions should companies consider in these economic circumstances and with these deficits?
Yeah, so I think companies should model out what they think the effects on them in particular will be from some of the proposals that we've seen, whether that's increasing corporate rates or changes in the international tax regime that are being proposed on the Democratic side, and also thinking about their supply chains and resiliency that they might have on that in response to some of the tariffs that might be coming for them, and thinking about where they're sourcing things, what the potential is for moving some of that production maybe to the United States, or also just the cost differential that's going to be, and whether or not they can pass on those costs to consumers and what that might mean for demand, or whether they'll have to make some other significant restructuring internally in order to address those problems.
Terrific insights as always, Karl. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for having me.
And for our viewers, the latest Election Watch and Week in Review are in the description of this episode. You'll also find a link to register for an upcoming tax readiness webcast on future-ready tax functions.
And in case you're not keeping count, there are 22 days until the election here in the U.S. Rohit and Janice are back this week with another episode of Election Watch. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us, and we hope you have a great week. Take care.